Hello there and welcome to our Alt24 special coverage over the Ukraine-Russia war, the so-called special military operation. President Biden and his group of 7 counterparts plan to unveil additional economic measures Monday to pressure Russia to end its war in Ukraine, including an effort to set a global price cap for Russian oil shipments. On this summit this morning, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky gave a virtual address to leaders from the G7 countries as they guaranteed in Germany to discuss the response to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On the battlefield, Russia hit the Ukrainian capital Kyiv with a barrage of missile strikes on Sunday, and what's likely is a direct response to Western leaders discussed aid to Ukraine at the G7 summit. And yesterday's night also Russia launched another military and missile strike against Odessa that injured 8 people. And on the economic agenda, Russia has defaulted on its foreign currency debt for the first time in more than a century, as the tough Western sanctions planned to punish Moscow for invading Ukraine restricts its ability to pay overseas creditors. To analyze all this information, I'm joined live via Skype platform by Mr. HARLEY, SCHLANGER, Vice Chairman of the Schiller Institute from Germany, and Mr. Alexei Yakubin, Doctor of International Relations from Ukraine. Gentlemen, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to this debate. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into our discussion, let's follow this report. On the second day of the summit, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky urged the G7 leaders to provide Kyiv with more weapons, in addition to imposing more severe economic sanctions on Moscow.
At the foot of the Bavarian Alps, in the far south of Germany, the summit of the Group of 7 takes place. For 3 days, the war in Ukraine, food and energy shortage, as well as economic inflation, top the agenda of the summit of leaders of the United States, Britain, Canada, Japan, France, Italy, Germany, and Ukraine as a special guest. Threatened by the legitimate ambitions of Beijing, the G7 put on track on Sunday, at the initiative of the United States, a vast investment program for developing countries supposed to respond to the huge project financed by China, but with still vague contours.
Today we officially launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. Collectively, we aim to mobilize nearly $600 billion from the G7 by 2027.
The Russia-Ukraine crisis overshadows the usual G7 agenda. Addressing the leaders of the Group of 7, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky demanded on Monday more weapons for his country and an additional tightening of Western sanctions on Moscow. In turn, the head of the European Union's Council of Governments affirmed that the 27 members bloc maintains unity in backing Kyiv against Russia's adventure in Ukraine, with money and political support.
The EU will continue to provide robust support to Ukraine, financial, humanitarian and political. And we have also mobilized €2 billion to provide military equipment, but Ukraine needs more, and we are committed to providing more.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson also urged his fellow Group of 7 leaders not to give in to fatigue over the war in Ukraine.
We're here in Germany with the richest countries in the world focusing on Ukraine and how to keep that coalition of support for Ukraine together at a time when, realistically, that there is going to be fatigue in populations and politicians.
Russia-Ukraine crisis turned the geopolitical, economic, and even environmental balances. The summit's agenda and priorities changed, and the issue of preserving the environment declined under the pressure of the energy crisis, inflation, and the future of economic crisis looming on the horizon, which may threaten systems and countries that have not yet recovered from the corona pandemic.
Mr. Harley, G7 meeting is hosted in Germany, so I will be starting with you. Before the summit of the seven nations started, Vladimir Putin held a face-to-face meeting with Alexander Lukashenko, promising to send him a short-range nuclear warhead. So, was this move only to warn the G7 leaders of any outrageous attacks on his country, or it was made as a simple precaution?
I think it was made as a gesture of friendship with Belarus. I think it obviously occurs within the context of a continuing war. But I think Putin looks at the G7 and sees a dying Europe, which he said recently in the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, at the Brics Summit. This idea, let me just start with a $600 billion proposal. I don't think the money's ever going to get there. There were promises of over $100 billion at the COP26 conference to help poorer countries deal with global warming. None of that money has come forward. The EU is strapped for funds now. They can print money, but look at what's happening inside Europe. You have strike waves in Germany. You have farmers and truckers in the streets in France and Italy and Greece. You had almost 100,000 people marching in Belgium against the NATO war policy. In Germany, they're about to start rationing of gasoline. So I think the European Union is in big trouble. The United States is also in big trouble. And in the meantime, what's this plan about? To counter the China Belt and Road Initiative, which they falsely call a debt trap. There are studies, even from within Britain, which show that the Chinese are not using debt to trap countries into an alliance with them. And in fact, the most recent study, said that it's the International Monetary Fund, which is the debt trap. So I think we're facing a summer of discontent in Europe, a degenerating military situation for Ukraine. And if people really care about the Ukrainian people and the nation of Ukraine, stop sending weapons and stop putting pressure on Ukraine to not negotiate. Negotiation must happen now, including the acceptance of a neutral status for Ukraine.
Quite understood. Staying with you, Mr. Harley. So the main idea of this summit of the G7 is only to put another economic sanctions on Russia, or what is the main idea?
Well, it's to show unity within the European Union. It's to adopt more sanctions. And look, the sanctions aren't really doing much to change the Russian behavior, are they? In fact, the ruble is strong, and what it's doing is pushing nations in the global south to recognize that you can't trust the West when it comes to economic policy. The United States and the NATO countries are stealing Russian sovereign wealth. They're trying to degrade the Russian economy. Meanwhile, at the Brics Summit, with especially Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, there were major deals signed for expanded economic agreements, which include real investment in the physical economy. So I don't think the Russians are fearful of the sanctions. The sanctions hurt. They should be lifted. But the sanctions are hurting the Europeans and even the Americans more than they are the Russians, and they're definitely hurting the poorer countries of the world.
Quite understood. Coming to you, Mr. Alexei, Ukraine's president is still pleading for more weapons from the EU leaders. So let us say he got what he is asking for. How this will help Ukraine to regain what it's already taken? I mean, don't you think that it's too late now to bring back the eastern part of Ukraine?
Actually, for Ukraine, this summit is important because we've seen that seven much powerful industrial Western countries common in the idea about the support of Ukraine. Because yes, I agree with Professor that before we seen some contradictional discussion about between different countries about the future support for Ukraine. But at the summit, G7, we've seen that these countries in this question, ready about the supporting Ukraine in future, continuous supporting. In the question of the weapons, now Ukraine has some problems because many Western leaders talking about much more weapons for Ukraine, but actually in reality, Ukraine got not much more weapons. Yeah, and for Ukraine, it's important that this process will be much more quickly than before the G7. Maybe we in future we seen in this some hurry up of this process. Mm-hmm. But as for me, this G7 looked watched for the world that G7 now to make a new role of this group, because before G7 it's in some aspect demonstrate like some speaking club, but Ukrainian problem, situation with the Russian invasion now need much more efforts from the G7, and from this position, G7 in some aspect positive for Ukraine, because Ukraine, from some statements Western leaders much more concern about the Ukrainian problems.
Mm-hmm, perfect. Now moving on to the battlefield. Russian missiles struck the Ukrainian capital Kyiv on Sunday, a day after a key eastern city fell to pro-Russian forces in a major setback for Ukraine, and as world leaders gathered in Europe to discuss further sanctions against Moscow. Let's follow this report.
Spared for 3 weeks from shelling, the Ukrainian capital Kyiv is once again a target of missile strikes. Ukraine's capital woke up at dawn with 4 explosions hitting a residential area. The shelling caused this 9-story building to burn, 5 people to be wounded, while others remain under the rebels.
We listen the voices under the crash, and we know the couple of people inside.
In the Donbass, the strategic city of Severodonetsk, a witness of the war's bloodiest fights, has fallen in the hands of the Russians, another victory for Moscow after it took control of Mariupol. A success crowned with medals from the Russian defense minister who visited his forces in Ukraine.
I have faith in you. You have many more glorious deeds ahead for the good of our homeland. Armed forces and airborne troops, I congratulate you. Take care.
And there in Moscow, the Russian leader received one of his most close allies, Alexander Lukashenko. Vladimir Putin announced that his country would in the coming months deliver to Belarus nuclear-capable short-range missile systems, a message understood by the West that the price of any intervention will be high.
We have made a decision. Within the next few months, we will hand over the Belarus the Iskander-M tactical missile systems, which, as you know, can use both ballistic and cruise missiles, both in conventional and nuclear versions.
In the wake of the 5th month of the conflict, Russia has achieved significant military achievements in eastern Ukraine. Meanwhile, NATO, ahead of its important summit in Madrid, warns the West that it must prepare to continue supporting Ukraine in a war lasting for years.
Mr. HARLEY, NATO summit tomorrow will be held in Madrid from 28th to the 30th of June. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said that last week Zelensky should attend the Alliance summit, but did not indicate what from this participation would take. So, what will change for Ukraine now after granting an EU candidate status last week? Will this candidacy grant Ukraine more aid for other nations, or it's only words on the script?
Well, let me give Alexei a little bit of bad news about what's coming out from the British military. The leaders of the British military have been talking about the breakdown of the industrial war economy of Britain, that they're not able to produce enough ammunition to deliver what they're promising. It's also the case that the United States has delivered a full year of ammunition production and is behind what they were promising. So there are a lot of empty words coming from NATO, empty words to the Ukrainians, but belligerent tone toward Russia. Now, this serves no purpose. There's no way that this war will be won by Ukraine The idea that this will go on for years, as Stoltenberg said, the next day Stoltenberg corrected himself and said, well, we hope there'll be a negotiated settlement soon. The point is that the death of Ukrainian civilians and military is serving no purpose for Ukraine or for NATO. There could be an agreement which would include guarantees of security for Russia and for Ukraine. So I think when NATO's meeting, we're seeing a lot of empty rhetoric, but in the meantime, people are dying as a result of that rhetoric. That's the tragedy, and that's why we need to go to a new security architecture in which there are no blocks. There's no NATO. What's the purpose of NATO right now? Is NATO really defending Europe from the Russians? I think that's a completely false pretense.
Quite understood, and it's a really strong statement. Mr. Alexei, what are you saying about this? NATO has no purpose for being an alliance in Europe right now, and the most important, Ukraine are sacrificing their soldiers, their civilians for a battle that should end with diplomacy, not with war.
From Ukrainian position, Ukrainian need much more weapons for the strong position in negotiate. Because now situation that Ukraine, in some weak position, according to the Russia, and some supports from on the weapons level and so on from the West, it supports for the much more to make much more stronger position Ukraine in the future negotiate. Because from the Vladimir Zelensky, they talking about the negotiate, but negotiate maybe not now, but in the future. After some victories, maybe some successful military action, maybe after some liberate of the Ukrainian territory now occupied by the Russian, in the south or in the east of Ukraine, and from this position, Ukraine also for the negotiate and also for the new security architecture in Europe. But after that Russia, some recombinate their ultimative position to the Ukraine, because now situation that from Russia position, maybe negotiate for Russia, it's some shadow game, not a direct position, not some clear position, but it's maybe some shadows for the military operate on the Ukrainian territory.
Quite understood. Now let's tackle what Zelensky has said. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has issued a warning to Russian pilots after strikes hit a residential building in Kyiv in the first attack on the capital in almost 3 weeks. Let's take a listen.
First of all pilots, dispatchers, mechanics, and other people who ensure the launch of missiles on Ukraine must understand, we will find you all. Each of you will be responsible for these strikes. And if someone thinks that he will evade responsibility by saying that they were just following the orders, you are mistaken.
So, Harley, this is the second strikes to the capital, Kyiv, in a week now from Russians. What that's supposed to mean? How can you read these attacks? And don't you think that Lithuania's move last week to block Russian shipments to Kaliningrad was made by another order by another nation to drag Russia to another war and push Moscow's attention away of Ukraine?
Well, let me come to Lithuania in a second. But I think President Zelensky has to answer the question of what about the Ukrainian forces that have been involved in the 8-year war against the people of the Donbass? Are they going to be punished? Are they going to be made to account for their killings and shellings and the people that whose lives they've destroyed? Look, war is not a good situation. It's terrible. The solution is peaceful negotiation for economic development and cooperation among sovereign states. But the problem is that it's NATO and the United States that are using Ukraine to try to degrade Russia. Now, the Lithuanian situation is just another example of this. Kaliningrad is an accepted part of Russia. They have treaty agreements that say that Russian rail can move across Lithuania to provide goods to the people in Kaliningrad. All of a sudden, Lithuania, a tiny country, is going to stand up and say, no, we're going to shut that down. That's a provocation against the Russians. And the Russians will, if they have to, use military force to open that up again. But why is Lithuania now being sacrificed? Well, Lithuania would be the basis for NATO to say, we can assert Article 5 and now go to war with Russia. Mm-hmm. Does NATO really want to go to war with Russia over the breaking a treaty agreement? I mean, you talk about the rules-based order, it's NATO that's breaking the rules. And this is where you see the hypocrisy of people saying we're defending the heroic people of Ukraine. No, the people of Ukraine are being thrown under the bus for the purposes of Western domination.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Mr. Oleksiy, back to the 21st of May last month, Ukraine's President Zelensky said that only diplomacy can end the war in Ukraine. And at the same time, now he is still calling the Western allies to keep delivering weapons. And he keeps encouraging his soldiers to fight until the end. Isn't that a sort of contradiction of what he is looking for?
No, I disagree with you because, in my opinion, it's not any contradiction. Because Zelensky thinks that Ukraine needs much more weapons for the good conditions for peace. Because, yes, Ukraine if Ukraine now negotiate with Russia, maybe it will be some kind of negotiative treaty, but it could be a weak treaty, weak peace treaty. Ukraine need a stronger peace treaty with the guarantees, and these guarantees Ukraine need from the strong position with the Western weapons, because it's a way that Russia understands, not the way about the peace negotiate now, but way with Ukraine ready for peace, but ready also for the war. And maybe this signal to Russia much more powerful would be much more powerful than only some calling about the peace negotiated. Because you watching the Zelensky speaking, calling to the Belarus also, because now some Ukrainian people fearing that maybe Russia want to join Belarus to this war. And Zelensky talking to the Belarusian people that it's a dangerous way for the Belarus, because this missile attack on Kiev and another cities, maybe it's some psychological weapons from Russia to influence on Ukrainian ready for fight.
Mm-hmm. Quite understood. Now, let's tackle the Georgian situation. Tens of thousands of Georgians resumed the pro-EU rallies in the capital Tbilisi in the front of the parliament's building. Protesters demanded the resignation of the prime minister after the country was not given candidate status by the European Union, while making Ukraine and Moldova candidates for EU membership. Mr. Harley, Georgia has been ruled since decades by oligarchs, and the well-known ex-politician Bidzina Ivanishvili, the billionaire founder of the ruling Georgian Dream Party, who kind of has a strong tie with Russians. Do you think that this latter will be an obstacle to grant Georgia the EU application, even at the future stance, taking into consideration one of the EU rules, de-oligarchization?
Well, that's an important point. The EU is showing its hypocrisy. There are Balkan countries that have been trying to apply to the European Union for years. Turkey has been trying to apply for years, and yet they keep rejecting the application. Now, because of geopolitical purposes, they want to move to the front Ukraine and Moldova. Look, it's important that there be economic and security guarantees for every nation. That's what Putin was demanding in the first place, that the Russians be freed from the threat of NATO forces on their border. You look at Georgia. Georgia is, again, you mentioned the oligarchs. There's a systemic problem in Ukraine, in Georgia, in some of these countries of oligarchy. The question is, how do you overcome that? And that's why we're calling for a convening of a new international conference, not a G7, not a European Union, not NATO, but an international conference which includes countries from the South to discuss how do we get a new Bretton Woods for an economic agreement and how do we get security guarantees. I'll just mention one thing about the NATO summit. The Spanish prime minister was talking about NATO, besides looking at Russia, NATO has to look to Africa, because of the fear they have of destabilizations in Africa. Well, NATO was involved in one of the biggest destabilizations, the overthrow of the Gaddafi government and the murder of Gaddafi. So I think the big threat to the world right now is militarization. And sending more weapons in doesn't guarantee peace. Making Ukraine appear to be stronger won't give them a better bargaining position. It will just ensure that the Russians will keep intercepting weapons and killing Ukrainian soldiers. So I think we've got to step back from this and recognize there's no solution in the military. The solution rests with international agreements that take up not just security, but also economic relations.
Staying with you, Mr. Harley, don't you think that Germany, now, since you are in German, is kind of responsible for the crisis that's happening inside the country? Why would they take back up Ukraine and cutting ties with Moscow without having other alternatives? I mean, why they didn't bring new agreements such as Italy made with Algeria and Angola?
Well, the German government is extremely short-sighted, but I think that's because they're just doing what they're told. This is what NATO and the US is telling them. Chancellor Scholz back in April said Germany will never provide offensive weapons. And then shortly afterwards, he reversed himself completely. Meanwhile, the economics minister, a Green Party member, Habeck, is already announcing that we're on the verge of rationing gasoline for automobile traffic, that the prices are going to quadruple for electricity because of the shortages of gas. And the German industry is facing the loss of 1 million to 1.5 million jobs because of lack of energy. Now, this is insane. This is what Putin said is the self-suicide of the NATO countries. This is not in the interest of the German people. I talk to people in Germany every single day, and they first of all start by saying, well, we have to support Ukraine. And I say, well, is supporting Ukraine working? And in the meantime, what's happening to Germany? And they sort of blush and say, well, we need another alternative. Well, we do. And that's why I'm saying this idea of a conference to address security for all sovereign nations is an urgent matter. And that's what my organization is involved in. And look, we're getting support from all over the world. That's what the Brics Summit was about. That's what's coming out of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Community. The African Union is talking about not falling into this bloc politics of having to support wars.
Understood, and it's really important points. Mr. Alexei, a couple of minutes left. So, Europe's unity over the war in Ukraine is at risk as public attention increasingly shifted from the battlefield to cost of living concerns. A survey in 9 EU member states found that despite strong support across Europe for Ukraine's bid to join the EU and the West's policy of cutting ties with Moscow, many voters in Europe want the war to end as soon as possible, even if that means Ukraine losing territory. What are you saying about this?
No, in Ukrainian society, we have some consensus about the join to EU because it's from the power of, for example, for the opposition leader like Yuri Boyko, they all support the Ukrainian way, the Ukrainian join to the European Union. And in the history of the European Union, you know, we have some examples that, for example, Cyprus, that country were joined to the European Union with some occupied territory. And from this position, Ukraine now need much more quickly, or maybe unique, way to the full membership to the European Union. Not only the status of the candidate, but it's some meditate position, but the full membership, and in much more quickly, maybe much more quickly than Finland, for example.
Quite understood. To this end, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. Mr. Harley from Germany, Mr. Alexei from Ukraine, thank you ever so much for your participation. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here with us on AL24 News. Take care of yourself and have a blessed Friday.